Hello everybody and welcome to MMA Start to Finish. Today we'll be talking about UFC 5 held in Independence Arena, formerly Independence Coliseum in Charlotte, North Carolina. We have some interesting things to talk about and some things, well, I would have rather watched, I don't know, two cats play with a ball of yarn than about 40 minutes of this card. But we'll get there. Oh, we'll get there. Any initial thoughts?
I was excited because, once again, we have Ken Shamrock versus Royce Gracie.
We didn't get baited this time.
As the advertising. But as far as initial stuff, I was just like, Dan Severn's back. That's cool. Get to maybe see these two fight again, which we do see them fight.
They advertised large boys as the tournament contestants. Contestants is a weird word. Fighters. They advertised large fighters. Except for Andy Anderson, who we'll get to.
Yeah.
Who was 5'9".
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's the small boy of the bunch.
Some slight rule changes to get to before we get into the fights. There is a 20-minute time limit on all tournament fights, except for the finale, or the final fight, rather, which has a 30-minute time limit. And the Ken Shamrock Royce Gracie super fight also had a 30-minute time limit. But they fudged around with that a little bit. Again, we'll get there. Before we get into the first fight, one more note. They went around the octagon as they're wont to do to introduce, the administrative people. And Ron Van Cleef, former UFC fighter, former victim of Royce Gracie, 51-year-old Ron Van Cleef, is the commissioner in a tuxedo. Strange sight, but I'm glad to see him in safety.
I think he learned real quick that he's better outside the ring.
This is a young man's game.
Yeah. A 51-year-old man shouldn't really be in here fighting.
It's borderline criminal negligence to license him at that point.
Yeah.
If they put in, like, Chemo versus Ron Van Cleef, can you imagine the carnage, how bad that would have went?
Chemo is very aggressive.
Yeah, he would have beat the shit out of that old man. It would have been scary. I would have been very upset.
Have Dan Severn.
Yo, he would have just, like, picked him up like a sack of potatoes, dude.
Just
carried him around. Put him on, like, a backpack.
Oh, man.
Anyway, another note, they actually have some highlights to fill up their intro with. Now that we've had 4 events, there's some clips. Bruce Beck referred to the UFC as the Olympics of martial arts, which is an interesting comparison considering the Olympics happens every 4 years. But, I understand the spirit of what he's saying.
Yeah.
It's a big event.
Well, the Olympics happen every 2 years. We have the winter and summer Olympics.
The specific Olympics are on a cycle of 4 years, but the Olympics period are on a 2-year cycle, winter and summer. Thank you for the clarification, Matt.
Yep, getting the semantics.
All right, the first fight of the night was Andy the Hammer Anderson versus John, I love to talk shit, but I'm not very good at getting hit, Hess.
Yep.
Fun fact about Andy Anderson, Taekwondo practitioner, and said he would be donating his purse to a charity that fights cerebral palsy.
Yeah.
So, unfortunately, the good guy does not always win, as we'll see here.
No. And we have John Hess, who is the practitioner for SAFTA, which is...
The SAFTA fighting system.
Yeah. Which is his own made system, the Scientific Aggressive Fight Style of America. And the announcers were clear to make sure that they, quote, don't know much about it.
And I'll give you a quote from John as he was in his intro video. He says, "I'm here to break people," and claims he's never lost in an unsanctioned fight. The problem with that claim, if these fights are unsanctioned, nobody has any way to know if you're full of shit or not. And after doing a little bit of digging on the very small Wikipedia article for John Hess, it doesn't seem like he was in very many fights, and he just loved to run his mouth.
No,
He's a big boy, I'm sure people didn't pick on him in school. He was busy putting kids in toilets and lockers,
Yeah.
He was the bully.
He is also the owner of several nightclubs and the Totally Nude Steakhouse in Long Beach, Texas.
I will give him credit there. I wouldn't mind visiting the Totally Nude Steakhouse. Now, I have an important question about the Totally Nude Steakhouse. I'd assume the waitstaff are totally nude, but am I also totally nude, or is that just for the workers? Are the people in the kitchen totally nude? Is the chef cooking with his hog out? I'm a little worried about that.
Oh, man.
We got to do some investigative work here.
That's some special beef.
Oh, boy. Jesus Christ. So even though we're talking all this shit about John Hess, he did win this fight. It was a lot of just weird, shitty punches he was winging. Andy fell on top of him for a minute, but neither of them really had any ground game to speak of, so they kind of just stalled until they both got back on their feet. John would bring him to the ground and knee him in the brain, and that would be the end of the fight. John called it off after that knee, and Andy didn't seem to be complaining too much about it.
Yeah, most of my notes are just about how, not even messy, just like
sloppy
John's punches were. He just kind of threw what he had available at Andy Anderson.
It seemed like he hadn't really had that many fights under him, didn't it?
Yeah.
Strange.
There were also several times where Big John had to step in and say, hey, stop poking Andy Anderson's eyes.
He just yelled, watch the eyes! Watch the eyes! Like over and over again.
At one point, he did have to separate them because Andy Anderson had his eye gouged.
He did have his eye gouged. The last note I have here is that John was just too big. Just too fucking big. We still don't have weight classes at this point. So, Andy was the odd man out being the small guy in the tournament, but regardless of how big he was, at this point, we're still bereft of weight classes, so he's pretty fucked.
Yep. Also, one thing we both forgot to say, as far as just what's happening with this event, our announcer, his name is...
Holy shit! Our ring announcer, not one of the commentators, the man announcing the fighters. Would you like to tell us his name?
His name is Ron Jeremy.
Ron fucking Jeremy. Unfortunately, not that Ron Jeremy. A different Ron Jeremy who is like a little redhead kid.
Yeah, he looks to be around... I wouldn't put him any older. I wouldn't put him any older than 30.
I wouldn't put him older than 25, dude.
Yeah.
He looks like he should still be, having his mom pack his lunch.
He did flub a few times with the announcements, but never in any serious ways.
I gotta say, as much as I appreciated Rich Goins, it's not like it's a downgrade. It's really a lateral move. They're about the same as far as quality goes. Again, to be fair, the sport's still so new. How are you going to be good at it? Even when Bruce Buffer comes in, his first couple events are pretty sloppy.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see that. Anything left on this fight?
John Hess wins and
advances for now.
Yeah.
Up next, we had Todd Medina versus Larry Thunderfoot, the firefighter Curitin. Larry Curitin was a kickboxer, and Todd Medina was a striker as well. Apparently, made us a little nervous about we might find on his resume, Todd Medina, friends with Kimo and Josan.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we really couldn't. He didn't have a Wikipedia page.
Nope.
And you didn't really find anything. Really?
I didn't see anything too crazy about him.
I imagine if he'd done something as bad as Josan, it would have popped up, and he would have a Wikipedia page to tell us about it.
I would hope so.
So, Todd seems to be in the clear, even though his friend is a felon.
Yeah.
The fight itself was 90s MMA. A lot of sloppy grappling, nut shots, and headbutts.
Yep.
Todd Medina did win, basically, just by holding Larry down and hooks to the nuts. Hooks to the nuts and headbutts.
Todd Medina also was using Bruce Lee's fighting style of Jeet Kune Do.
Yeah, Jeet Kune Do, yeah. I forgot about that.
Yeah.
A lot of the fighting styles at this point, it's just like, this is the thing I kind of do. And then once they get in there, it's still, like baby steps,
Yeah.
Like nobody looks really well-rounded. Either you're very good at one thing and you try to stick to that, or you kind of sloppily do everything until you land something weird, like a hook to the nuts.
Medina also quickly learned that headbutts are a thing.
Yes.
And this started a new trend for the night. Everyone started doing headbutts, and it was just the new hot shit to do.
I have in my notes several times, vicious headbutts. It's weird. Once you see somebody do something in these events, people are like, not a bad idea, and they pick up on it. It's still so early, and there are so few rules that people are still trying to figure out how this shit works.
Yep. It's like, I never even thought of doing it that way, and they do it. Curitin tried to get a choke on Medina, but it didn't hold.
I mean, it was a guillotine choke. All he knew was to wrap his arms around the neck, but he didn't really know how to use his hips or position the legs or really how to get a grip on the choke. It was, very early stages of MMA still.
Yep.
There's a couple times later in the card, there was a time when the guy wound up winning the fight, but there was a rear naked choke just shouting at him to go for it, and he elected to punch the guy in the face, which, that works too.
Yeah.
The next fight was Oleg Taktarov, the UFC's, to our knowledge, first Russian competitor versus Ernie Verdisia. Ernie was a paramedic from Miami, came into the octagon looking incredibly tan.
Yeah.
Incredibly tan. Oleg was a Sambo guy. He came out in the gi, and it showed that he was at a much higher level when this fight played out.
Yeah.
Before we get into the fight, though, Matt has some fun facts for us about Oleg Taktarov.
Oleg, our new Russian friend, is also an actor. He has been in several movies. He was in National Treasure. Some of these are, of course, after the fight. But he was in...
All of these after the fight, because his first thing
True,
here
yeah.
is in 97, where he was Boris in Total Force.
Some notable movies he's been in. Air Force One. He was Russian prison guard, number two. He was in Bad Boys 2 as...
Yosef, name I can't pronounce.
Yeah. He was National Treasure as Shippen. He was also in an NCIS episode.
I'm starting to think our friend Oleg here was typecast. Let me just read you the names of his roles. Boris Chekhov, Russian officer, Russian prison guard, Dmitry, Oleg, Boris, Sergey, Yosef, Gordy, Shippen.
Yep.
You get the point.
It
I could
keeps
just
going.
keep going. They're all just Russian names. You get the picture.
He was also in 2010's Predators. You may recognize him from some of these things. So
Some would argue a better acting career than a martial arts career. I will say, though, Oleg does come back. This isn't the last time we see Oleg.
Good.
Oleg...
He's a neat guy.
He is a fun guy, and he's got quite the filmography.
He's also a very polite man.
He was very nice. He was very. I always feel like that. Like Russian athletes are always very quiet and keep to themselves unless we're in a Rocky movie.
Yeah. Like in his intro, that little video intro they give him, he just said a nice, gentle little thank you at the end of it.
And proceeded to strangle Ernie with an anaconda choke to end the fight. He got him on the ground, and I'm sure Ernie had seen prior UFC events and was a little bit familiar with the ground game, but got choked out pretty quickly by Oleg with an anaconda choke. And it's always fun to see good anaconda choke. I do have here Oleg, also a big fan of the headbutts, working them in there as well to get the choke open.
Yep. He also realized, I can do headbutts. These are a thing I can do. Oleg did not have to put in a lot of effort.
It's very true. It was not quite the same level of stress as Todd Medina in his fight. He came into his next fight looking all bruised up. Oleg, I don't want to say there wasn't a scratch on him, but he seemed pretty okay to me. The next fight coming up, we have some pretty interesting characters. The return of Dan to be Severn. He's back, and he's ready to consume more humans. Versus Joe... And I swear, this is his nickname. The announcers were very happy using this.
And he chose this nickname.
He did.
So this isn't just put on him.
Joe the Ghetto Man Charles, who was an interesting character. Did you find anything interesting about Joe Charles?
He wanted... Well, you mentioned the Olympics earlier. He actually was trying to go into the 1984 Olympics.
He was training for the Olympics, yeah.
I couldn't really find exactly what for. Obviously, it was something with martial arts. I'm guessing wrestling.
I think it might have been boxing.
He ended up getting hurt in a work accident with a forklift, and it broke his femur. So
that's pretty fucked.
That put an end to that career.
Did you see if that was before or after this event?
1984 Olympics.
84 Olympics. Oh, wow. So he recovered from a broken femur to fight in the UFC anyway.
Yeah.
How about that?
You can do anything you put your mind to.
You can get in there and get manhandled by Dan Severn if this is how you choose to live your life.
Mm-hmm.
Dan elbowed him a few times, had him up against the cage, and then just wrapped those big arms around his neck and yanked him the fuck off the cage and choked him out. Pretty quick fight. How long did this one last? This fight lasted for a minute and 38 seconds. Dan making quick work of his prey.
I hate to just focus on like how they appear, but there's two things I wanted to mention about Joe Charles. One, his coming out outfit as far as like to the arena.
His garb, his entrance attire.
Garb is a very fitting word. It's vaguely Arabic.
He looked like he was on some Aladdin shit.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to be offensive, But he looked like he was on some Aladdin shit.
Yeah, this is an audio podcast, so there's not a whole lot of visuals.
Prince Ali, Fabulous He. Ali Ababa. You get the picture. He was wearing a headdress and,
Maybe he should have kept on the headdress because...
Dude. Protect his neck?
Not even. It's his interesting hairstyle. It's like the back of his neck and head is the only place where he has hair.
Holy shit, I forgot about that.
I just remembered because I have this in my notes.
Oh my god.
It's a very strange hairstyle.
What a shit show.
But yeah, he at least, I mean, he tried for a while. He was about on par with Dan Severn's size, but he just couldn't handle Dan the Savage Man.
Joe also had some prior UFC experience. He was an alternate in UFC 4 where he just destroyed his opponent, and based off of that is why we see him here in UFC 5. And I think we'll see him back here in the UFC. I don't know when, but I don't think this is the last time we see Joe Charles.
Maybe, I don't know.
But that is for another day.
All this is new to me.
Up next, we have David Bennett versus Todd Medina. You may ask yourself, who is David Bennett? Once again, the tournament format, little spotty. Remember John Hess, big manly man who's never lost a fight? Well, his hand hurt a little bit. He had a bruised hand, so he had to pull out. Dave Bennett, the Canadian wrestler, was his alternate replacement. And David took on a deflated Todd Medina, who came out with several black eyes.
Part of why John Hess probably backed out was because of just those messy punches.
Yeah, when you throw like that with nothing on your hands, it's a great way to break your hands.
Yeah, like, I've been here a little bit at Julian's place, and he has a punching bag, and he let me try his hand wrappings and these boxing gloves. I threw one punch that was wrong, and I felt it in my elbow, and I didn't do any more than like 10 different punches.
And he had his hands protected.
Yeah. So, I can imagine punching someone in the face.
In the forehead.
Forehead, bones, without those wrappings, and just wildly swinging. That's not going to feel very great.
Hands are not very good for hitting stuff. What's great for hitting stuff are your elbows and your shins.
This is why we made tools.
This is why we advanced into the Stone Age.
Yeah.
It's because people like John Hess got tired of breaking their hands.
Shit hurts. I'm tired of breaking my hands.
So this
on
fight...
this damn deer.
Just imagine, it's so dark, just some dude wailing at a fucking deer messing his hands up. The fight itself, not much to say really. Todd was depleted. Dave got on top of him, the fresher fighter. Hit him in those bruised eyes a couple times. Corner threw in the towel. And Dave advances to the finals as an alternate.
Yep.
A practice that is all too familiar.
Yeah. Todd's crew threw in the towel.
Good practice. We actually saw... I'm trying to remember what the fight was. At UFC 232 very recently, I'm dating this podcast a little bit. I forget which fight we saw where the corner threw... They didn't throw in the towel, but they did not allow their fighter out of the corner to continue fighting. Man, I'm gonna hate that I can't remember what fight that was. But it's a practice I wish we'd see more. I know I've said this before. I sound like a broken record, but... Corners got to get better at protecting their fighters, especially when things clearly aren't going well. Mm-hmm. Up next, the semifinal. Dan Severn versus Oleg Taktarov. And our poor, kind friend Oleg had the bejesus beaten out of him. The fight was pretty even for the first minute or so, but once Dan got position on him up against the cage, just dropped the most violent knees I've ever seen.
This reminded me of when I was looking down at a cabinet I had, and my leg slipped out from under me, and my knee hit the floor, and it shook the house. And I'm just imagining now forcing that knee down onto someone's head repeatedly, and it really gave me an idea of how violent this is.
I know I focus on the sound of strikes a little too much, but this sound of Dan's knee just colliding against Oleg's brain give me chills a little bit terrifying. Oleg bleeding all over the place. John called off the fight after 4.5 minutes because that was a gnarly ass cut and they needed to close that shit up.
Yeah. There are also some USA chants, which make sense for this time.
Only a few years after the Cold War.
The first Russian guy versus this big American meatball.
Dan Severn is an American icon. I could see him on a poster with some bald eagles. The flag.
Also, this was the first fight where Oleg didn't look very calm, probably because of all the knees to his face.
The knees to the brain are going to do that a little bit.
Yeah. Big John called it for Severn, which is for the best. No way Oleg was getting out of there.
Now, the next fight we have to talk about are, not only will this segment be shorter. Not only will this segment be shorter than the fight, this whole fucking podcast will be shorter than this one fight. It was a draw, by the way. Ken Shamrock versus Royce Gracie. This fight met the 30-minute time limit. They made up some rules on the fly, gave them a 5-minute overtime. The 5 minutes actually wound up being like 6 minutes, and the entire fight just consisted of Ken Shamrock laying in Royce Gracie's guard.
Yep.
Kind of garbage. The crowd lost their shit. I was telling Matt earlier in the car, anytime there's like a 30-minute lull in the action in modern MMA and the fans start to boo, I just want to strap them to a fucking chair and make them watch this fight. This was painful. This is physically painful. At a certain point, we just started skipping through the fight because...
No, we didn't.
We did. We skipped through some of it.
Tonight we did.
No.
The first time we watched
we skipped through like the last 10 minutes, dude.
If you say it. Well, I think probably.
We did.
Because at that point it was a half hour.
Yeah, it was ridiculous. It was so horrible. And I have some actually important information. So, this UFC event was the last... I'm reading this off Wikipedia, obviously. This UFC event was the last with the involvement of UFC co-creator Royce Gracie, ostensibly because of the introduction of time limits, which ran counter to his family's ethos of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, in which fights should go to a finish. Gracie and his partner Art Davie later sold WoW Promotions, co-promoters of the event, to WoW's partners Semaphore Entertainment Group, SEG. So, Royce Gracie also ended his involvement following Honan's departure. I might be fucking that name up, by the way. Until he returned for UFC 60. So this is the last time we're going to see Royce Gracie in the UFC for a very long time. So this event, they also have on here, saw the introduction of time limits because of some satellite issues from UFC 4. So this event, let me read this to you. This show ran 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was 40 minutes over the scheduled time. But UFC purchased 3 hours of satellite pay-per-view time in preparation. This was unlike UFC 4, where many pay-per-view providers cut the show off after the first 2 hours. So some people, I think I remember hearing about this now that I'm reading this. In UFC 4, some people missed the end where Royce Gracie defeated Dan Severn. A lot of people saw that end and thought Dan was going to win. And they just never knew. And it was the 90s, bro. So they had no way of figuring it the fuck out.
You just had to find out from someone who knew.
So this clusterfuck was a historic clusterfuck, and I'd also imagine this fight was part of the reason they introduced the concept of stand-ups, where the refs are allowed to stand up the fighters if this is going on. Because this, again, painful to watch. Really was. I imagine you don't have a ton to say about this fight, Matt, but the floor is yours.
Boy. So it started with some quick jabs and kicks, but nothing real major in the first 5 minutes. They go down to the ground. Ken got up at one point.
I'm going to just dispute the notion that they were on their feet for 5 minutes. They were on their feet for like a minute.
Okay.
I don't want to give you the illusion that this was a fun fight to watch. If for some reason you're listening to this and haven't seen UFC 5, don't watch this fight. Just don't do it.
Yeah.
It's a warning.
It's not worth it.
Dude, I would have rather watched kittens play with yarn.
That would be more
It'd
entertaining.
be way better.
It's hard to beat that, though.
It is pretty hard to beat that.
Yeah, my notes consist of how long the fight has gone on and little change. 10 minutes, little change. 17 minutes, little change. 22, 27. Ran out the clock. 5-minute overtime. 36 minutes of nothing.
My notes, I just have guard battle, comma, forever, in all caps.
We did learn one thing, which is Ken has, well, we didn't learn this from the fight. You actually told me this at the time, and then I guess maybe you forgot about it up until this point where I remind you. Ken Shamrock has a manga or a comic, a Japanese comic book series.
Oh shit, that's right. They were saying that in the introductions.
Oh, okay.
Ken Shamrock, big in Japan. We mentioned before in UFC 1, his prior experience was pancrase fighting in Japan, which was the closest thing to MMA before the UFC. So, Ken Shamrock, like a lot of artists, big in Japan.
Yeah. Also, this is just the announcers messing up again, but it was kind of funny. So out comes Ken Shamrock. He's all smiles. He's big, buff. Got that
Wearing
nice,
a Speedo.
Wearing the Speedo, but he also has this nice robe on. He comes out into the octagon smiling, and they're talking about his past success.
I believe Jeff Blatnick was the commentator who fucked up.
Yeah, and they're talking about how he was good at it's shoot fighting, right?
Shoot fighting, and also his prior UFC experience where he did well.
Yeah, and so they're talking about that, and one of the quotes is, "He's had some success here," and of course, just as they say, "He's had some sex here."
He removes his robe.
He removes his robe. He starts removing his robe, and he's got this big smile on his face. And then we have almost 40 minutes of Ken laying on Royce Gracie.
This just in, Ken fucks.
Yep.
Ken absolutely fucks. And Ken and Royce, not a great combination.
He has some trouble finishing, though.
I'll leave it at that. Nothing else needs to be said about that fight. I'll have us move on from here. Finally, we have our main event of the tournament. Dan the Beast Severn versus Dave Bennett, the alternate, making it to the finals. We have a $50K prize pool for this fight.
Yeah.
Dan...
They dropped it down from $60,000.
I imagine that was because they had to give some of that money to Ken and Royce for the super fight.
True.
I imagine they made a pretty hefty penny themselves.
Yeah, because it's a draw.
It was a draw. Jesus. Let's not get into that again. Anyway, Dan didn't want to be the same disappointment that Royce and Ken were and made quick work of Dave Bennett, taking him down after a pretty even grappling exchange, because I believe Dave's background was wrestling as well, so they come from the same background. Dan did, however, manage hold him down, get a key lock, or an Americana, whatever you want to call it, bent his arm backwards, and got him to tap. Dan also awarded a nice shiny belt. Finally, a belt for the champion this time.
Yeah. It's always nice to get a physical object.
What'd you have on this fight, Matt?
Pretty much just that. They both kind of held their ground while they were standing. Eventually, Benito got on the fence. It's not Benito.
Benito!
It's Benito. I'm sorry. I keep thinking of things. He got on the fence. David had this one foot that was kind of dangling, and I pointed it out while we were watching it, and Dan
scooped that shit up.
Scooped it, brought him down, and that was kind of the end of it right there.
That was all she wrote. A quick ending to an event that went on far too long.
It was a tenth the time that it took Royce and Ken Shamrock.
I think all of the fights combined were still shorter than Ken versus Royce.
Yeah.
It was a clusterfuck, man.
Yeah.
So that's UFC 5. We had a good time watching it, that one fight notwithstanding.
Yeah.
Up next, I want to see here what is on the docket for the next time you hear from us on MMA Start to Finish. I believe it's just UFC 6, but I think this may be the slot in history where we see the first Pride event. Let me just verify that before we go. Up next, we have UFC 6 Clash of the Titans. Dan Severn versus Ken Shamrock on the poster. Hopefully that'll be more interesting than the last super fight.
Yeah.
Like we said, no more Royce Gracie from this point moving forward. So, until next time, thanks for listening, guys. If you're listening to this on YouTube, please like the video, leave a comment, tell us what we could do better, be nice.
Constructive criticism.
Constructive, not destructive. And we'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.
Adios.